Welcome to the Develop Yourself podcast, where we teach you everything you need to land your first job as a software developer by learning to develop yourself, your skills, your network, and more. I'm Brian, your host. All right, today on the Develop Yourself podcast, I have a self-taught web developer, Michael, who's going to walk me through Rails and his journey as a self-taught developer doing project-based learning. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brian. Happy to be here.
Me too, man. It was cool how we met. And for those of you that don't know, because of course you don't know, how did we meet, Michael? How'd you end up talking to me today?
Yeah, so I listened to your podcast, specific episode. I really liked the "Don't Be a Junior Developer" episode. Everybody should be able to listen to it if they haven't. It's an awesome episode. Yeah, and I was looking at Parsty, your boot camp, and set up a meeting with you pretty much after I listened to your podcast. And then we just started chatting on our call. We had a 15-minute call and just started chatting. And Ruby came up, Rails came up, because that's what I'm learning. Then, yeah, we just decided to do this.
When you told me you were learning Rails and doing the self-taught route, and you seem like you're pretty far along the self-taught route, I was like, oh, that's really cool. And I remember using Rails years ago at a startup. And at one point at coding boot camps, it was like the thing to learn. Like everybody was learning Rails. It's also really popular right now. It's popular in that it's, I think, easier to get hired for Rails because there's less Rails developers than there were like 5-10 years ago. And it's a really popular framework. I don't know a lot about it, but I know a lot of people are really interested in it. And this episode, I kind of I'm pretty much a noob. So you definitely know more Rails than I do. So I want to go through like, what is Rails? What is Ruby? How are you learning? And generally, what people can take away if they want to go the self-taught route.
Yeah. So Ruby is a programming language. It was developed or created in the 90s by, I forget his full name, but he's a Japanese developer. He goes by Mats. So Mats created Ruby. And then the language Ruby existed. It wasn't super popular, I would say. A lot of people were using it for learning coding, because it's a super simple language in terms of syntax, which is one of the reasons.
Looks like Python almost.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely far away from, the Javas of the world and things like that. Very simple. And so that's the language itself. And then 2002, 2003, 2004 era, David Heinemeier Hansen, DHH, created the Rails framework. And so Rails is a full stack web development framework that uses the Ruby language. And that's essentially the difference between the two. So Ruby is the language, and then Ruby on Rails is the framework.
Thank you. Thanks for that explanation. Because I learned Ruby and Rails while working at a startup years and years ago. I really enjoyed it. And it was something I kind of wish I'd stuck a little more with, because I actually did end up interviewing with GitHub, and it was all Rails. And I was completely like out of my depth at that point. And I'm like, dang it. That was when it was like a strictly Rails shop. And if you didn't know Ruby on Rails, you just couldn't get a job there. What are some of the projects you started off with when you were learning Rails? And what were some of the challenges that you had when you were doing that?
Yeah, so I started a lot with just doing Rails new, which is just how to create an app.
And that's the command line.
That's the command line. Yeah, so
to scaffold a new app.
To scaffold a new app, yeah. So let's say you wanted to do a library app, right? Rails new library, and you change the directory into that app. But I'd say the first project, what I learned a ton on in terms of pushing my limits as a programmer, was this musician to musician marketplace that I wanted to build. And this is one of those ideas I had when I was at the beginning of my journey. And like, this is an idea I have, I want to be able to execute on it. And so building a two-sided marketplace is, complicated from a business standpoint. But it's also super complicated in terms of a programming standpoint, in terms of, setting up a database and setting up, restrictions in terms of who can interact with who and to what extent. And that was one instance where, I was really, I think, pushing my limits as a programmer and like my abilities, which felt great. But, there's so many things where I just, I had no idea. I had to ask somebody or ask ChatGPT to be like, what is going on with this? and how do I add validations in this way to do this.
Yeah.
Um, so I learned a ton doing that. And then I guess one of the more simple ones I built was just a simple, no authentication, simple sign up. So a user can type in what I called like a code name
Hmm.
to kind of like sign this like pact I made. It's like a very static web page,
Okay.
and the user could enter their code name, and the code name would show up in the database and be displayed on the website.
Oh,
And
cool.
something super simple,
Yeah.
super simple.
Simple.
Yeah,
Teaches
but
you how to
you.
use a database and how to
Mhm.
use the front end and connect it to like a back end. It's a really great project, actually.
Yeah, simple, form validation as well.
Oh, yeah. Right. Yep.
Yeah, and along the way, you learn a lot about how to do things the Rails way. All right.
So yeah, I definitely want to talk about the Rails way because that's
Uh-huh,
like a really interesting thing in Rails magic. There's a few catchphrases you always hear in the
uh-huh.
Rails community: convention or configuration, convention over configuration, Rails way, Rails magic. But before we get
hmm
to that too, you're taking the self-taught route, which I'm impressed by. I also see that it doesn't work for most people, to be just
hmm
completely honest. For
hmm
you, it does. It seems like you're doing a great job. How do you know like what to do as a self-taught developer? Like how did you know to build this thing, and how did you know like that you need to learn these little pieces? Because you're saying all the right things. You're saying I need to build like role-based permissions, authentication, form validation. You're hitting all the right stuff. Who told you this stuff?
Well, I'll start off by saying um, the support of the Odin project, that's a community, and you have that backing as a community. Um, and when you're stuck, they're there for you. And that's one of the things that are great about the Odin project. I didn't do this alone. Like it's super hard to do this. If I was on my
Yeah.
computer all day long, right, for 5 hours, it's like that you're not really you're doing your work in like a microcosm, right? And that's why I
Hmm.
reach out to folks like you or my Ruby mentors, because you need those people. Um, and but knowing how to do those things comes with just time and being genuinely interested in what you're doing is so 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 important, I think.
Hey, happy early Thanksgiving. And if your goal in the new year is to become a software developer, join me at parsity.io. We have 2 spots left for the first cohort of 2025. I cannot wait to start working with this team of people, and they're going to get a major discount also if they apply before the end of November. Okay, that's it for me. Hope to see you in. Back to the episode.
I have come to love Ruby and Ruby on Rails, and I was initially drawn to it, and that's why I'm talking about it on this podcast with you, and that's why I still do it now. um, and I see folks who are
Hmm.
learn whatever language because that's what someone told them to do, or they think that's the right way to do it. And this is way easier said than done, but you follow your own compass in terms of what you feel like you should do next. um,
Yeah.
and you have to trust that, and that's not always easy. I've gone the wrong direction before, no doubt about it. Um, I've jumped ship and done a random project that maybe wasn't as productive as, maybe sticking to the Odin project would have been. Does that answer your question?
No, totally.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
I think that's really helpful. I'm just always curious because
hmm
the self-taught crowd is like I've said before, they're very vocal, but I feel like they're also in a super minority. And so it's interesting when I meet people that are doing it right because I'm always like, how do they know?
hmm
Because I know a big part of being a good programmer in general, being a good software engineer, is figuring things out.
hmm
Like no one's going to hand you the answer to everything. Like you're going to have to just kind of figure out, well, how do I do this thing? And I think you've hit a really important point is that you're using a community of people and being okay with saying, hey, I do need help, or hey, what should I do next? Or hey, what are you
hmm
doing? So you're
hmm
doing all those things which are proactive, like even talking to me, like that's the how we met up. Like
Right.
you're out there making these connections. You're doing all the things that are going to make your path towards software engineer or towards the product you're trying to build much quicker. And I think that's a big piece that people are missing. It's not all about like how much random tutorials can you consume or how many projects can you just build. It's like how do you get the right information at the right time from the right person to get you
hmm
to the next step.
Definitely.
So yeah, I appreciate you kind of talking about that. And that's really good. So people use this phrase a lot, convention over configuration in the Rails community. What does that mean?
Yeah. So Rails has a way of doing things. There's definitely the way that you could do it, or the way someone else could do it, but there's kind of this Rails way that is the standard, right? When you go look
Hmm.
at the Rails guides, there's a way that DHH wrote those guides, or him and his team at 37 Signals wrote those guides for you to do it in that way. For example, let's say I want to do form validation, like simple form validation. I could do that by writing a form tag, an input tag, a label tag in vanilla HTML. And that would work fine in a Rails app, right? That would work totally fine. Um, but Rails gives you ways to do that in a way that, let's say, for example, you wanted to create, in our library example, a new book. You could do the method form with, and that model is immediately a part of that form, right? And those validations, those input labels, you can use helpers, Rails helpers,
Yeah.
another type of method. Um, you can use that for those. Um, so the option of configuration is always there, right? Rails gives you
Yeah.
that option if you want it, right? Um, but you know, Rails also has a way of doing things to make your app more readable, more maintainable, and for other programmers to be able to read it and maintain it. Uh, so
That's
yeah.
that makes a lot of sense, and that's a big part of how to help developers do things the right way, like these patterns that get established. Because it's so hard when you're reinventing the wheel, which is kind of one of the issues I think that React has or had, especially in the beginning. Like you could kind of scaffold an app however you want, right? There's no
Mhm.
like real convention. Like there's some things that have become convention because people have done them a lot, but there's no guidebook like here's exactly how you should make a React app, or here's exactly how to do a Next.js app.
Mhm.
Now, I think there's a lot more convention over the years, but Rails really started with that in mind, which a lot of people say, oh, that's kind of magic. And I feel like that was almost like a cheap shot at Rails sometimes, like, oh, it's Rails magic. And what do you think about Rails magic? Or when people say that, what does that mean too? Like what is this idea of Rails magic?
Um, the Rails magic. I think it's less of a black box than people think it is. Like once you learn some of the conventions, you know, it's definitely does a lot for you, which is one of the reasons that I love it. And the Rails magic um, is a part of that too. That kind of black box, I guess, or whatever you want to call it.
And I guess Rails magic meaning like you can type something in the command line and then scaffold, for example, like an app, but you can do Rails new an app, or you can do, I think, Rails, you can create all sorts of cool things like a database and then like
Mhm.
form validation. So you have all these helpers which immediately scaffold kind of complex pieces of an application. And then
Mhm.
they're just there. And you could just use them without really knowing how they work. But like you're saying, they're not totally a black box, meaning you can, if you know like a little bit about what's going on under the hood, you can kind of piece together how these things all fit together is what I'm kind of picking up.
Yeah, definitely. Like it's not uh it's understandable if you dive into it, right?
Hmm.
The magic is it's like there's a formula for the magic. There's a formula to get to the point that it's at. Um, and even me, I don't know everything about what's in that black box, right? It's like it's pretty hard to know everything.
Yeah.
But I love the power of typing in the command line, like Rails generate model,
Hmm.
whatever it may be. Um, and it helps me get from point A to point B a lot faster. And
Yeah.
as I think I develop as a programmer, more of those things you do pick up as you go along. Um, but I hear Rails magic less maybe than like in the time before me. I don't hear it as much as like convention over configuration or the
Uh,
Rails way or things like that.
I
Uh,
bet you that's because like everything's a little bit magic nowadays. Because I feel like a lot of what used to be really unique and cool about Rails is now bled into many other frameworks. Like with a Next.js app, you create a full stack Next.js app with Prisma or whatever, some database layer, but
mhm.
just a simple command. And that just wasn't a thing like
Yeah,
2 years ago, really. I mean, that just
yeah.
wasn't a thing you could do. Or now you have like forms too. I've seen this thing, TypeScript form, which I use at work.
Hmm.
And it's the same idea you just said, where you have like models which are mapped to your form and they come with validation out of the box. And it seems really magical. And now these things have kind of spread out. So a lot of what was
Mhm.
unique about Rails and people like. I just see other people adopting in other places. So that makes sense. You don't hear that thing because everything's a little bit magical
Yeah,
nowadays.
I mean, I've started a JavaScript app with npm install, and I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't
Like,
know
oh,
what is. I mean, I know like one or two of these files, maybe I'll modify, but it's like this all this just happened, and I'm like overwhelmed by it. Um,
crazy.
but I think you're right. It's bled into a lot of a lot of the other frameworks and languages that are used on the web.
As you're learning Rails, are there any like particular places where you suggest people that are curious about doing this? Like outside of the Odin project, are there places like communities, forums, or books even that you would recommend? Or even YouTube channels?
Yeah. So for Ruby specifically, I would say people read Wise Poignant Guide to Ruby. I don't know if
Oh,
you've ever
cool.
heard of it.
Never heard of that one actually.
It's entertaining.
Okay.
It's a comic book, to put it simply. It's a comic book that teaches you
Oh,
Ruby.
really?
Yeah.
It's really cool. Is it new or is this
Keeps.
an older book?
Oh, it's old. It's old. It's old.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm not sure exactly when, like late 2000s, something like that.
Great
Um,
name.
yeah, it's yeah, Wise Poignant Guide to Ruby. That is what I kind of started learning Ruby through that. Before I wrote a
Okay.
line of Ruby code, I read that. Not in its entirety, but it's entertaining to pick up and quirky and interesting. If you're starting a Rails app, Rails guides, the guides are amazing. They're pretty descriptive. They can be a bit technical, so it's kind of rough if you don't know Ruby itself, or haven't done it before. But they're always kind of what I fall back to if I need help in terms of setting up form validation or learning how to use the routes or something like that. Yeah. And then, yeah, the Odin Project. I'll say again.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It- he's not sponsored, by the way, but
No, I'm
I
not
think
sponsored. I'm not sponsored. I would love to
neither am
be,
I.
but no, but what I love about that is open source. So they couldn't sponsor me if they wanted to, I don't think.
But that's
But
true, actually. Yeah, they're not really going to pay anybody at all
yeah.
because there's no
Yeah.
incentive for them to do that
Yeah.
at all. Yeah, I've heard nothing but great things about Odin Project. I remember I think it was, I mean, it's been around for a long time, I feel like, because even
It
10 years
has.
ago, I believe I was like looking into it and it was much more, I looked at it recently and it's really grown. It's a lot more robust, for lack of a better word.
Mhm.
I believe it when I first looked at it, it was like pretty bare bones, but it had really good projects.
Yeah.
Remember the projects were like stretch types of projects. I was already
Mhm.
employed at the time as a software developer, and I was like, "Oh, these are really good." Because I probably know less than you know right now, honestly, when I got my first job.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
So,
it's a great way. I think the Reddit thread that I looked at when I just Googled like how to build a website, I looked at
yeah.
it recently and it's 10 years ago from today. So
Oh,
it's been around
yeah.
for a while. But now they've added a node path. So if you want to go the JavaScript route, that's
Yep.
available for you too. But I think originally it was just Ruby on Rails. But yeah, I mean, I love the projects on it. Yeah, I could talk
They're
about the Odin
tough.
project all day, but uh, yeah, they are
That might be
tough.
another episode. Yeah, they're tough, which is good. I think that too many people, I don't want to hate on any of the other platforms out there because I love them too. I mean, I love Scrimba. I love Code Academy. I always recommend people start with those if they want to learn how to code like really basic things like HTML and CSS. I'm
Mhm.
like, that's a great place just to go start.
Mhm.
I do kind of not like the whole idea of this, like, let's stick to these cookie cutter examples and just live there alone. Like, that's not going to make you an employable software developer, in my opinion. I think those are
Mhm.
great tools to use when you're just acquiring those basic skills or you want to learn something new. If I wanted to learn Java and I don't know any Java, I'd probably start at Code Academy right now or
Right.
Scrimba or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
I'd start at some platform. But immediately I'd want to get enough where I'd get off that platform as soon as possible, writing in my code editor and using Git and GitHub and deploying something somewhere, which is what the Odin project, if I'm not mistaken, that is the intention. It's kind of like, here's a project and you're going to build it and then like on your own
100%.
outside of this platform.
100%. And that's probably why I fell in love with it. It empowered me as a developer right from the bat. Like you're not writing HTML in browser. You're not writing CSS in browser. They're
Mm-hmm.
teaching you how to use Linux commands. They're teaching how to install Git. They're teaching how to install VS Code. Like from the jump, you're a developer and you feel like it. And that was super empowering to be in like the
Yeah.
first few lessons, know what a div tag is, know what an HTML document is, be able to like go to localhost 3000 and see what I just put in a code editor. Like that again, you're right. There's great times to have Code Academy and
Hmm.
Udemy, and if I want to learn, go deep into some data structures and algorithms, CS50 might be great.
Yeah.
But if you want to go from zero and push yourself up to being 100 or wherever your goal is, um, you know, it worked great for me to be able to get empowered right away and be a developer right away. Right.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, you're immediately started kind of like what people did really before all these things existed.
Hmm.
Like it was
Hmm.
just like figure it out, like get a code. I remember going to a meetup and I was like, how do I had this really basic question. I was like, how do I write code? Like, where do you write it? And so at the time, it was like Dreamweaver or Notepad.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then it was, of course, I think Sublime was really big, and then
Right.
then VS Code, of course, now it's taken over,
Hmm.
and that's where I started. Like then I did feel empowered. I'm like, oh, now it's like now it's my code. It's not like
Hmm.
living on CodePen or some other weird browser platform.
Hmm.
Like now I really own this code. And then I learned Git and GitHub, and then things exploded from there. And
Right.
that's where I had just so much fun doing that. I have no doubt from just speaking with you in our previous conversation and now that you're going to be employed, soon. And what do you say to people? Kind of the last thing that's on my mind. Of course, I
Hmm.
have to ask. What do you say to people who say is Rails still a relevant skill in 2024 and 2025? Hey, I hope you're enjoying this episode, and if you're interested in becoming a software developer, learning how to build complex software, and actually get hired, join me at Parsity.io. If you're serious about joining, just schedule a call with me by clicking the link in the show notes below.
Yeah, I would say yes, simply. And
Me too.
I was talking to, I went to a meetup, I think last week, and talking to a bunch of different programmers, guys who are unemployed, guys who studied in college and now have a job they kind of like. And I've talked to folks who, are in a fast growing startup right now and they're doing embedded
Hmm.
systems. Um, and all these folks, they're like, you know, learning MVC architecture is something that's never gonna, that's only changed, right? It's universal, right?
Yeah.
And it may not be that you're learning React and, Node.js. Well, those things are great and they're kind of popularized and hot. Um, Things are going to change in the JavaScript world like that. And I think I mean, Ruby and Rails has been around since 2004, 2005. That is, I mean, it's an evidence of its longevity,
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
And I think in terms of learning, it's so powerful because once you know the Ruby language, you can focus more on the MVC architecture you want to learn. You want to learn the intricacies of an ORM, right? You don't have to focus on writing an API between different JavaScript frameworks. I'm passing on
Yeah.
JavaScript, but
But you're
it could be
right.
any, it could be anything, right? Yeah. You don't have to worry about that kind of stuff, right? You know Ruby, you've learned enough Rails to the point where you can navigate your way. You know some Rails magic, right?
Hmm.
Um, you can focus on the controllers. You can deep dive into that without the cognitive overhead of learning JavaScript or Java or whatever backend language you need to transfer, between the front end and back end, right? It's
Yep.
Ruby everywhere. Um, and, even if I don't get hired for Ruby, even if I never use Ruby again, I know what MVC is. I know what an HTTP request and response does. Like those things I can focus on and go deeper because all the surface level stuff I don't have to change every single day. So, absolutely.
That I think you have super good points as usual. Also, I'll say this. There was a study or a survey done a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago, and it looked in Rails developers were in high demand.
Hmm.
Now, the caveat to that, of course, is there were less Rails jobs. Of course, they're not like as ubiquitous as JavaScript jobs in
Right.
general.
Right.
JavaScript doesn't even really mean anything nowadays. I'm like, JavaScript is just one of those things like that could mean so many things now that
Hmm.
like it ceases to mean a single thing.
Hmm.
Could mean backend JavaScript, TypeScript, whatever. But
Hmm.
I have Rails on my resume from like 7 years ago, 6, 7 years ago. I still get people hitting me up for Rails jobs. Even when I tell them, I'm like, hey, look, it's been a long time.
Hmm.
I know so little. And they're like, that's okay. That's okay. I mean, I know that they are struggling to find Rails and Ruby developers in many places. And a lot of massive corporations and even smaller shops still use Rails because you're right. It's easy to get a project going. They
Mm-hmm.
scale, it scales pretty well. I mean, you have companies like GitHub and Shopify running on them.
Mm-hmm.
So you need Rails developers. And there's few languages I would say just not to learn. And those few would be like COBOL or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm not really big on like betting all on a technology stack. I definitely have opinions on what I think I would learn and what I would probably not learn. But yeah, I don't think that try to time the market is a great way to become a developer or just be happy.
And I
Yeah.
think that kind of what I mentioned earlier of like I do and learn Rails because it's something I'm passionate about. And I would encourage any junior developer, beginning developer, let's say. I don't like
Mhm.
to use the term junior. After I listen
Yeah,
to
me
your
neither a
podcast,
little
I'm
bit.
like, you know,
Yeah.
it's people are at different levels. But anyways, if you're starting, you know, find what language you like to look at. You like to write, you know, try out a bunch, try out all of them, you know, find what's
Yeah.
going to get you going. What makes you want to open your computer and write code, right? That's the thing that's going to keep you going. It's not going to, you know, if you're, you know, learning React because you see like a bunch of React jobs on LinkedIn. Like what when the interviewer asks you why React? Why it's like, oh, because there was a bunch of jobs. Like you have to be able to say like it's because I love using state effect. You know, I love using that component. You know, I love using this thing, right? Um, and I think a lot of people get tossed around, and I see a lot of people in Odin Project too. You know, it's a lot of people starting to learn. They just
Mhm.
get tossed by the waves of the market, and
Yes.
it's so tough to see. It's like, oh, I stopped the Odin project for this amount thing because I want to go learn Python doing this, and Python is great. Everyone should, you know, dabble in Python. But having no trajectory in terms of, you know, your goals and where you want to be
Hmm.
makes you really susceptible to the waves of the market or the waves of your friend who's a CS major, whatever he told you. Um,
Yeah. Or even this
so,
podcast. I mean, I'm somewhat
yeah.
guilty of this too. I mean, sometimes like, oh, I should learn this, and it's my opinions and things I think. But you're right; it's a good way to become what I call a Swiss Army knife developer,
Mm,
where you're many things to many people. You can do all these things poorly,
mhm,
and you don't know one thing. And you're right; you got to find something you actually enjoy doing. Because if you don't enjoy it,
mhm.
it's gonna suck if you do get the job. Because then you're gonna be stuck doing this 8 hours a day or
Yeah.
more, learning it all the time, and being like,
Yeah.
ugh, I don't even like this. And now this
Yeah.
is what I know how to do, and I'm kind of stuck doing this for
Yeah.
the foreseeable future. Man, any last words of advice for people out there, especially early career coders?
I'd say two tips, two things that I've picked up that have been super valuable is time management and having some kind of structure of when you're going to do things. Because I've gone through periods of where I have great structure. I think particularly external commitments, whether it's a job or uh, you know, volunteering to do something, driving your girlfriend to work at 7 a.m., whatever it is, right?
Hmm.
Having external commitments will allow you, give you the freedom to block out time management. And, you know, those external commitments are huge. And that's something that I'm still learning. Like I've gone through dips of where I've had structure. It's been great. You know, I thrive. I work for 5 hours on, you know, I go to job, make some money, go volunteer, and then I come back and I got 5 hours of coding time and I'm ready to sit down and do it. But I've also
Hmm.
gone through periods of time where I don't have a lot going on. And it's really hard for me, I find, to sit down and code because, you know, a 12-hour day with nothing on the calendar is rough. It is rough
Yeah.
to be productive. And so I think implementing some kind of structure, having some external commitments, it is massive. Especially as a self-taught person, you have to embed that in your structure in your system because you're going to need that to keep going. And second thing is smaller thing, but reading documentation. I
Mm.
would say don't shy away from it. Um, I don't know if you've ever read the Ruby documentation. Find something you love and stick with it and set some goals and make sure those goals are specific.
Super solid advice. And I was like nodding my head vigorously when you said the thing about like having other commitments that somehow seems to actually help me too when I need to focus on stuff. It's so funny. I feel like the more time I have sometimes, it's like the more time I just have not really productive with.
It's
The busier I get, I feel like
counterintuitive.
the more I just kind of yeah, it's so weird. I gotta look up why that is because there's gotta be some scientific reason or some human behavior reason behind it because I don't get it. But every time I get really busy, I feel like I find the time to make sure I get all these things done. And when I have like a ton of time, I'm like, damn, why didn't I do anything? I don't know
Mm.
why, but that's so funny. I guess it's not just me. Hey man, where can people find you online? Are you online and active or what?
I am a bit. I started a
Okay.
YouTube channel. So it has a couple videos. I'm gonna try and start keeping it going. It's called Day Zero Devs. Day Zero
Okay.
Devs.
Day zero
Uh,
devs.
it's got some
And it'll be in the
mindset
show
stuff.
notes and all that stuff.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah, I can send you the link. It's got some mindset stuff and some technical stuff as well. But I'm gonna focus it a lot towards, I have ADHD, so it's like it's being self-taught, having ADHD, learning in that way. I'm gonna try and give some mindset tips and for those folks, or just, developers who are interested in learning. Also some Rails stuff, some Ruby stuff. Um, the scope is a bit broad, we'll see. It's still early
That's
stages.
cool.
Um, and then yeah, LinkedIn. Michael Kihanya. My last name is Kihanya. If they want to connect, I'm happy to talk, whatever it is about. Yeah, hit me up. I'd love to talk.
Awesome. Man, thank you so much for being on the show. And yeah, really cool to have you on here and talk all this Rails stuff. Thanks a
Yeah,
lot.
it was fun, man. It was fun. Thanks for having me.
For sure. That'll do it for today's episode of the Develop Yourself podcast. If you're serious about switching careers and becoming a software developer and building complex software and want to work directly with me and my team, go to parsity.io. And if you want more information, feel free to schedule a chat by just clicking the link in the show notes. See you next week.